It happened 90 minutes after dark over Greater Tunb Island, a scrap of volcanic rock sitting almost exactly in the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. According to U.S. Central Command, American aircraft and naval strike assets spent that window systematically taking apart coastal defense systems, cruise missile storage bunkers, and missile launch sites built into the island's terrain. CENTCOM confirmed the operation directly. Iranian state-affiliated media, specifically the Fars news agency, reported a second position was struck on nearby Hengam Island the same night. This was not a one-off headline. It was one entry in a list that, by early August 2026, had grown so long that CENTCOM's own public affairs office had started numbering the nights consecutively, because there had been so many of them that ordinary people were losing count. If you have not been following the story closely, that sentence alone should stop you. The United States Central Command has been striking Iranian coastal defense targets not for one night, not for 1 week, but across a campaign that, as of the first days of August 2026, had reached a 12th consecutive night of strikes according to a U.S. Department of War release. That is not hyperbole for a thumbnail. That is a documented ongoing military campaign against the very system of missile batteries, radar sites, fast attack boats, and mine-laying capability that Iran built specifically to make the Strait of Hormuz too dangerous for the rest of the world to use. To understand what the U.S. Navy has actually been doing to Iran's coastal defenses, you need the full arc, not just one night's headline. So let's build it properly, from the beginning, using only what has been confirmed by named sources, military statements, wire services, and the Iranian side's own state media where it disputes or adds detail. Where something is claimed but not confirmed, that will be said plainly, not smoothed over. The current chapter of this story begins on February the 28th, 2026. That is the date the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes against Iran, opening what is now referred to, in open source military tracking and encyclopedic record keeping, as the 2026 Iran War. Among the opening actions of that war was the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a number of other senior Iranian officials. This was confirmed across multiple outlets and is treated as an established fact of the conflict's timeline, not a rumor. Whatever your view of the strategic wisdom of that decision, the practical effect was immediate. Iran's political and military command structure was thrown into crisis at the exact moment its coastline was coming under sustained attack. Within days, the campaign against Iran's naval and coastal capability had a name: Operation Epic Fury. Footage released by CENTCOM and shown at a Thursday briefing by CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper at CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida, showed strikes on Iranian naval assets, including what CENTCOM described as a drone carrier roughly the size of a World War II-era aircraft carrier, engulfed in flames after being hit. CENTCOM's own public statement at the time put it starkly. American forces, in their words, were not holding back from the broader mission of degrading the Iranian Navy's operational capacity. That is a direct paraphrase of CENTCOM's own public messaging, not embellishment. By March 18, 2026, roughly 3 weeks into the campaign, Reuters was reporting a number that puts the scale of this operation in perspective. More than 120 Iranian naval vessels had been neutralized since the campaign began. That figure came from Reuters' own reporting, sourced to the ongoing operation, and it lines up with CENTCOM's public messaging about targeting Iran's fleet, missile stockpiles, and elements of its defense industrial base. On that same day, CENTCOM confirmed the use of 5,000-pound deep penetration munitions against hardened Iranian coastal missile sites. Those are not small tactical weapons. 5,000-pound bunker-capable munitions are built specifically to reach targets that have been dug in, reinforced, or built into rock and hillside, which is exactly how Iran has historically protected its coastal missile batteries. This is worth pausing on because it explains why coastal defenses is not some vague catch-all phrase in this story. Iran's approach to defending its coastline and threatening the Strait of Hormuz was never built around a conventional blue water navy that could go toe-to-toe with U.S. carrier strike groups. Instead, over roughly 2 decades, Iran built what military analysts call an anti-access area denial network, commonly shortened to A2AD. It is a layered system combining shore-based anti-ship missile batteries, naval mines, fast attack craft designed to swarm larger vessels, and increasingly, unmanned systems, both aerial and maritime. The backbone of the missile side of that system includes the Nor missile, a derivative of the Chinese C-802 anti-ship missile, with an estimated range between 120 and 170 kilometers, and active radar guidance in its terminal approach to target. More recent additions to the arsenal, the Qadr and Ghadir missile systems, are assessed, based on Iran's own public claims, which is an important caveat, to reach as far as 300 kilometers, which would allow coverage of large stretches of the Strait of Hormuz from launch positions well inland, tucked into hills and caves along the southern Iranian coast. That is the system the U.S. Navy and allied forces have been working to dismantle piece by piece for months. And the reason it matters beyond the immediate battlefield is straightforward. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the global economy. Before the 2026 war and the closures that followed, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and around a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas moved through that narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. When Iran closed the strait in response to the initial February strikes, it did not just escalate a regional war. It put pressure on a piece of global infrastructure that touches fuel prices and shipping insurance rates far beyond the Middle East. Before any of the strikes on Greater Tunb or Qeshm ever happened, the United States had already spent weeks quietly assembling one of the largest concentrations of military power the Middle East had seen in years, according to defense briefings and open-source flight tracking data reviewed by Army Recognition as of February 18, 2026. That posture included carrier-based strike assets, long-range bomber coverage, integrated air and missile defense systems, and forward-positioned ground units. At the center of it was a potentially three-carrier configuration at sea. The aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln had been operating in the Arabian Sea since late January, positioned roughly 700 kilometers from Iranian shores, escorted by the destroyers USS Michael Murphy and USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., along with support ships USNS Henry J. Kaiser and USNS Carl Brassier, plus Coast Guard cutters Robert Goldman and Clarence Sutphin Jr. A Nimitz-class carrier like the Lincoln typically embarks somewhere between 70 and 75 aircraft, a mix that includes FA-18EF Super Hornet multi-role fighters with a combat radius exceeding 700 kilometers, F-35C Lightning II, stealth fighters built to penetrate contested airspace, EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft whose job is to suppress enemy air defenses before strike packages arrive, and E-2D Advanced Hawkeye early warning aircraft that track the battlespace from above. Sustaining that kind of force projection over months, as this campaign is run, requires enormous tanker and airlift support behind the scenes. The part of these operations that rarely makes it into a headline, but that makes everything else possible. By late March, that carrier presence had grown further. CENTCOM released video on March 28th showing new strikes on Iranian naval vessels, with CENTCOM writing directly that Iranian naval vessels had, in its words, threatened and harassed global shipping in regional waters for decades, and that those days were now over. That same week, the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli arrived in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, carrying roughly 3,500 sailors and Marines as the flagship of the Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, the same Marine unit that weeks later would take part in seizing the Tuska under the blockade. The same 24-hour news window also documented the human cost on the American side directly. 12 Americans were injured when an Iranian ballistic missile struck Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, an attack Fox News confirmed through two independent official sources, with a regional source indicating the strike combined ballistic missiles and drones. This is worth including because the campaign against Iran's coastal defenses did not happen in a vacuum, where only one side was taking hits. Iran was still capable, at least in March, of reaching U.S. and partner installations hundreds of kilometers from its own coastline. By early April, CENTCOM's own public framing had shifted toward describing a dominance rather than just degradation. In an update released that period, CENTCOM stated that American forces now controlled the skies, in the command's own words, by launching from the sea, releasing new video specifically framed around efforts to eliminate Iran's mobile missile launch capability. The truck-mounted and easily relocated missile systems that are far harder to target than fixed coastal batteries because they can be moved between strikes. CENTCOM added at the time that the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was continuing what it called around-the-clock operations in support of Operation Epic Fury, meaning that by that point in the war, the United States had two full carrier strike groups, the Lincoln and the Ford, operating in the region simultaneously. President Trump's public statements through March 2026 tracked the pressure this closure created. On March 3rd, he said the U.S. Navy would begin escorting tankers through the strait as soon as possible. On March 22nd, he threatened to, in his words, obliterate Iranian power plants if the strait was not fully reopened within 48 hours. Iran's Defense Council responded by threatening to lay mines throughout the Persian Gulf, a threat that, notably, later became a real operational problem, which we'll come back to. On March 23rd, Trump postponed his own ultimatum, citing what he called very good and productive conversations with Iran. That back-and-forth threat and pause, became something of a pattern across the spring. By mid-March, U.S. military planning had moved beyond strikes alone. A report from Army Recognition, a specialist defense publication, described the United States actively considering ground forces to physically dismantle Iran's coastal defense network and secure the strait outright. Not just degrade it from the air and sea, but occupy and clear it. That same report is where the detail about the Noor, Qadr, and Ghadir missile systems comes from, framed explicitly around the argument that air and naval strikes alone might not be sufficient against a defense network built in hardened, distributed positions along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Then, on April 13, 2026, the conflict entered a new phase entirely. The United States imposed a formal naval blockade on Iran, covering, according to the blockade notice itself, the entirety of the Iranian coastline, including Iranian ports and oil terminals, and applying to all shipping traffic regardless of flag. This followed the collapse of what are referred to as the Islamabad talks, an attempt at negotiation that failed to end the war. The blockade was commanded under the authority of President Trump, with CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper and Admiral Samuel Paparo named in connection with its execution. 6 days later, on April 19th, the blockade produced its first direct enforcement action. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, working alongside the destroyer USS Spruance, seized an Iranian-flagged vessel named the Tuska. By April 18th, CENTCOM stated it had intercepted a total of 23 vessels under the blockade. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's own tracking authority, separately reported that by April 20th, at least 26 ships had managed to slip past the U.S. blockade line in both directions, a detail worth including because it shows this was never presented as a perfectly sealed operation. Even U.S. reporting acknowledged gaps. There is also a financial detail about the blockade that rarely gets attention, but matters for understanding how the United States has tried to make this pressure durable rather than temporary. Reporting on a draft blockade framework described a proposed ban on Israel-related cargo moving through the strait, paired with a fee structure explicitly described as covering costs like insurance and environmental protection, rather than functioning as a direct toll on the value of cargo passing through. That distinction is not just bureaucratic language. Under international maritime law, coastal states are generally permitted to charge for genuine services rendered to shipping, such as safety and environmental measures, even in situations where charging a straightforward toll on transit itself would not be permissible. In other words, part of the American legal strategy behind the blockade appears to have been structured specifically to survive scrutiny under the same body of maritime law that Iran might otherwise invoke against it. Iran did not simply absorb the blockade. On April 18th, Iran announced it had closed the strait again, explicitly citing the United States' refusal to lift the blockade as its justification. This is an important nuance. The strait's closure and reopening through 2026 was not a single event, but a repeated cycle tied directly to the blockade's status, each side using access to the strait as leverage against the other. On May 29th, following renewed U.S.-Iran negotiations, President Trump announced the blockade would be lifted. For a moment, it looked like the maritime conflict might be winding down. It was not. What followed instead was a summer of renewed, and in some ways more intense, strikes specifically targeting Iran's coastal defense and radar infrastructure, the exact subject of this story. The trigger, according to CENTCOM's own account, was an attack on a commercial vessel named the Ever Lovely. In response, on June 26th, CENTCOM reported carrying out retaliatory strikes on Iranian military targets, explicitly describing the operation as hitting infrastructure linked to Iran's missile and drone capabilities, along with coastal radar systems, including sites on Qeshm Island and other locations along Iran's southern coastline. Qeshm Island is significant here. It is the largest island in the Persian Gulf and sits directly astride the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, making its radar and defense installations central to how Iran monitors and threatens shipping through that choke point. The very next day, June 27th, an oil tanker named the Kiku was struck by a projectile while transiting the strait, damaging the vessel's bridge. CENTCOM's assessment was that the Kiku had been hit by an Iranian attack drone. The U.S. military response was immediate. Further airstrikes against Iranian military and communication sites positioned near the strait. Days later, on July 1st, the human cost of this campaign became visible in a different way. A United States Navy aviator was reported missing after a Sikorsky SH-60 Seahawk helicopter, carrying 4 crew members assigned to the USS George H. W. Bush, went down. That detail is included here deliberately, because a story about coastal defenses being dismantled is still a story with real personnel and real risk attached to it on both sides, and a responsible account of this conflict should not erase that. Through this period, there is also a genuinely strange and underreported wrinkle in the story. According to at least one report, Iran itself lost track of naval mines it had planted in the Strait of Hormuz, leaving Tehran unable to fully reopen the strait even when it wanted to, because its own forces could no longer account for where their mines were. U.S. Central Command stated that American ships operating near the strait around this time were conducting mine clearance operations, and Iran reportedly threatened those clearance vessels. accusing the U.S. of violating an existing ceasefire understanding by operating in the area at all. This detail matters, because it complicates any simple narrative of one side acting and the other reacting. By midsummer, elements of Iran's own defensive measures had become a hazard the country was struggling to manage on its own coastline. By early July, the tempo of U.S. strikes against Iranian coastal and military targets had become close to nightly. On July 8th, CENTCOM posted directly that, at the direction of the commander-in-chief, its forces had started conducting additional strikes against Iran specifically to further degrade Tehran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The same CENTCOM statement described the strikes as holding Iran accountable for what it called unjustified aggression against commercial shipping and civilian crews navigating what the U.S. termed a vital international waterway. That same day, a separate CENTCOM release confirmed forces had completed an additional round of strikes specifically to degrade Iran's capacity to attack commercial shipping and civilian mariners in the strait. From there, the pace becomes almost procedural in its regularity, which is itself worth noting. Because a campaign that produces near-identical press releases night after night is not a single dramatic event. It is sustained attritional warfare against a defense network carried out methodically over weeks. On July 11th, footage released by CENTCOM, shown as a screen grab from an official handout video, documented what was described as a third round of strikes that week, targeting missile and drone sites, naval assets, and coastal defenses, aimed at reducing Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping. Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency reported, on its own side, that air defenses around the Bushehr nuclear power plant in southern Iran had been activated in response, though Mehr noted there had been no official comment confirming what triggered that activation. Mehr also attributed explosion sounds heard near Sirik in eastern Hormozgan province to clashes occurring in the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz, shortly after Iran's official IRNA news agency separately reported U.S. strikes on the Iranian island of Hengam. That same wave of strikes, according to the Jerusalem Post's reporting on CENTCOM's announcement, specifically targeted coastal defense systems, cruise missile storage, and launch sites on Greater Tunb Island over a 90-minute operational window. There is a small but geopolitically loaded footnote worth including here. Iran has controlled Greater Tunb Island since 1971, but the United Arab Emirates has maintained its own territorial claim to it for just as long. Striking Iranian coastal defenses on a disputed island adds a layer of regional complexity that goes beyond the U.S.-Iran conflict alone. CENTCOM's strikes that night came after what was described as 7 hours of earlier strikes against Iran that same morning, involving aircraft, drones, and naval vessels together, meaning Greater Tunb Island was not an isolated action, but the second wave of a single, extended day of operations. The nightly rhythm continued. CENTCOM's own official releases document a July 19th strike described as the 9th consecutive evening of operations against Iran, and a July 20th release confirming yet another completed round the following night. Fox News video coverage from around this window described CENTCOM as having pounded Iranian coastal military targets and IRGC-linked positions for an 8th consecutive night, specifically naming air defenses, maritime assets, and missile and drone storage sites as targets, alongside Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps units that CENTCOM accused of involvement in attacks on U.S. troops stationed in Jordan. Iran, for its part, claimed strikes on its own nuclear-related targets during the same period, a claim that appears in Fox News' framing of Iranian statements, but is presented there as Iran's own assertion, not as something independently confirmed by CENTCOM or by Western wire services. That distinction matters, and it is being stated here explicitly rather than blurred together. The pressure did not stay one-directional. On July 29th, CENTCOM confirmed what it described as a heavy wave of strikes against Iran, explicitly stated to be in response to attempted Iranian missile attacks against U.S. forces the previous day. This is significant because it shows Iran was not simply absorbing losses passively through this summer. It was attempting, and in this instance, apparently failing, to strike back at American forces directly, which in turn triggered further American strikes on Iranian coastal and military infrastructure. By the first days of August, a U.S. Department of War release confirmed CENTCOM forces had completed strikes for a 12th consecutive night, without providing extensive additional detail in that particular release beyond confirming the operation had occurred. Which brings the timeline to where things stood as of early August 2026, right up against today. According to reporting compiled from open-source military tracking, as of August 6th and 7, the naval blockade of Iran remains active and ongoing, with CENTCOM reporting that 49 ships had been redirected as a direct result of the blockade. Separately, Forbes reported claims that the broader war has significantly depleted Iran's weapon stockpiles, a claim that President Trump has publicly denied, which is precisely the kind of contested claim that deserves to be flagged, rather than stated as settled fact. On the financial and economic side, U.S. officials have stated the blockade is costing Iran approximately $500 million per day, while Iran has responded by seizing at least 2 cargo ships of its own in retaliation, and by 3 ships being seized by the United States over the course of the blockade, according to tracking through this period. There's also a broader regional picture that helps explain why this conflict has not simply fizzled out despite months of strikes. Israeli military activity has continued in parallel, particularly against Lebanon, where the Israel Defense Forces conducted air and artillery strikes in early August against what it described as weapon storage facilities and a command center, citing the killing of 2 Israeli reservists near Majd al-Zun days earlier. Diplomatic talks between Lebanon and Israel have continued in Rome, described in reporting as having reached a 7th round of negotiations, focused specifically on the status of detainees, with what's been characterized as limited progress. None of this is the Strait of Hormuz story directly, but it is the surrounding regional context in which the naval and coastal campaign against Iran has continued to unfold, and it is part of why de-escalation has proven difficult to achieve, even as individual strike waves come and go. It's also worth understanding why a 5,000-pound bunker munition, the kind CENTCOM confirmed using against hardened coastal missile sites back on March 18th, is the specific tool chosen for this kind of target, rather than a smaller, more precise strike weapon. Iran's coastal missile batteries, particularly the more advanced Qadr and Ghadir systems, believed capable of reaching out to roughly 300 kilometers, are not typically left sitting in the open. Based on the assessment described by Army Recognition's defense analysis, Iran's defensive architecture is deliberately designed to counter exactly the kind of standoff, precision-guided strike campaign the United States has run against it, meaning launchers and command infrastructure are dug into hillsides, tucked into natural terrain along the southern coast, and distributed across dozens of positions, rather than concentrated in a handful of easy targets. A smaller precision weapon might destroy a radar dish or a launch rail sitting exposed, but a hardened bunker built into rock requires a weapon with enough mass and penetration to defeat the structure itself before its warhead can even function. That is the entire logic behind the U.S. decision, documented by CENTCOM, to escalate from earlier precision strikes to deep penetration 5,000-pound munitions, specifically once the campaign moved into targeting Iran's most protected coastal missile infrastructure. This also explains why the campaign has taken months rather than days. A distributed, hardened, deliberately redundant coastal defense network cannot be eliminated in a single strike package, no matter how large. It has to be worked through site by site, which is precisely the pattern visible across the CENTCOM press releases from July and August. Night after night, a new set of targets, a new stretch of coastline, a new island. Qeshm on June 26th, Greater Tunb and Hengam on July 11th, a 9th consecutive night on July 19th, a 10th the following night, a heavy retaliatory wave on July 29th, a 12th consecutive night reported in the first days of August. Each individual release from CENTCOM reads almost identically to the one before it, and that repetition is not a sign of nothing happening. It is the actual signature of a grinding, systematic campaign to dismantle a coastal defense network built specifically to survive exactly this kind of pressure. It is also worth being precise about what coastal defenses has meant as a target category across these months, because CENTCOM's own releases group several distinct capabilities under that heading. It includes the fixed and mobile anti-ship missile batteries built around the Noor, Qadr, and Ghadir systems. It includes coastal radar installations, like the ones hit on Qeshm Island in June, which feed targeting data to those missile batteries and to Iran's naval forces more broadly. It includes cruise missile storage and launch infrastructure, specifically named in the Greater Tunb Island strikes on July 11th. It includes drone and unmanned maritime systems, referenced repeatedly across CENTCOM's July releases alongside missile and naval targets. And it includes the naval mine-laying capability that, by summer, had become disorganized enough that Iran itself reportedly lost track of where its own mines had been placed in the strait, leaving American mine clearance vessels operating in Iranian-claimed waters even after a ceasefire understanding was supposedly in place. An operational detail Iran protested, but that CENTCOM defended as a necessary humanitarian and navigational safety measure rather than a hostile act. There is one more dimension of this story that a purely military account risks leaving out, and it deserves to be named directly rather than skipped past for pacing. Human rights reporting from this same window paints a grim domestic picture inside Iran. The United Nations Human Rights Chief stated that Iran has executed at least 56 people since March, according to Reuters, reporting carried by U.S. News and World Report. Separately, Iran Human Rights, an independent monitoring organization, was cited as recording 71 executions in July alone, with at least 444 executions total in Iran through 2026, as of early August, figures reported through Shabtab News coverage of that organization's tracking. UN News separately described what it called a sharp spike in executions and death sentences inside Iran. These figures come from human rights monitoring organizations and UN statements, not from CENTCOM or Pentagon sources. And they are included here because they are part of the honest, full picture of what has been happening inside Iran during the same months its coastal defenses have been under sustained external attack. A country fighting an external war while its internal human rights situation has, according to these monitors, deteriorated sharply at the same time. So, stepping back from the individual, strike-by-strike detail, what does it actually mean that the U.S. Navy has done something described as unbelievable to Iran's coastal defenses? Based on everything that is verifiably on the record, it does not mean a single, isolated, cinematic moment. It means a sustained, multi-month campaign, beginning with Operation Epic Fury in late February and early March, continuing through a formal naval blockade in April and May, and escalating again through nightly strikes across June, July, and into August. That has systematically targeted the specific architecture Iran built to control the Strait of Hormuz, its coastal missile batteries at Qeshm, Greater Tunb, and Hengam Islands, its radar systems along the southern coastline near Bushehr, Sirik, and Hormozgan, its naval vessels, with more than 120 reportedly neutralized by mid-March alone, and its mine-laying capability, which by summer had become so degraded and disorganized that Iran itself reportedly lost track of mines it had planted in its own waters. Whether you consider that unbelievable is a matter of perspective, but the scale and duration of it, backed by CENTCOM's own repeated public confirmations across months of nightly press releases, is not in dispute. What remains genuinely uncertain, and should be treated as such, includes several things. The claim that Iran's weapon stockpiles have been critically depleted comes from Forbes' reporting, and is explicitly denied by President Trump, so it sits as a contested claim rather than a confirmed fact. Iran's own claims about striking U.S. or allied nuclear-related or military targets during this period come from Iranian state or semi-official outlets like MER, Fars, and RNA, and while they are worth including for balance, they have not been independently verified by CENTCOM or by major wire services in the reporting reviewed here. The precise operational effectiveness of Iran's remaining coastal missile capability, how much of the Noor, Qadr, and Ghadir system survives after months of strikes, has not been publicly quantified by any named source and should not be assumed either way. And the exact current legal and practical status of the blockade, given that it was lifted on May 29th and then appears to have effectively continued or resumed in some form through the summer, based on August reporting of redirected ships, is genuinely unclear from open reporting and deserves more scrutiny than any single video can give it. The sources behind everything in this account include U.S. Central Command's own official public releases, Reuters wire reporting, the Jerusalem Post, Fox News, Al Jazeera, Forbes, UN News, Iran Human Rights via Shabtab News, U, Hess News and World Report, Army Recognition's Defense Analysis, and Lloyd's List for Independent Shipping Data. Iranian state and semi-official outlets, specifically MER, Fars, and IRNA, are cited where they add detail or dispute a claim, and are identified as such rather than treated as equivalent to independently verified Western or international reporting. So here's the honest question this leaves on the table, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. After nearly 6 months of sustained strikes against Iran's coastal defense network, a formal blockade, dozens of intercepted vessels, and a strait that is opened and closed multiple times depending on the state of negotiations, has the strategic goal of securing free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz actually been achieved? Or has it simply produced a new, more dangerous equilibrium where the fighting continues at a lower, quieter intensity night after night? What do you think happens next in the Strait of Hormuz? Does this campaign wind down, or does it keep going at this same nightly pace into the fall? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching.